The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our Raiders out on the West Coast. We are going to get started here in about a minute or so. We're just waiting for a couple more attendees to join, and we'll get started shortly.
All right, John, I think we can get started.
Perfect. All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for our course rating webinar on the first 5 obstacle factors. My name is John Suazo. You're going to hear from both Scott Hobday and Matt Duffy from the USGA Handicapping and Course Rating Department today. This is the second webinar in a series of 3 USGA webinars designed to help new course raters. And first off, as always, I'd like to confirm that everyone in the audience could both see our screen and hear my voice. And if you could just shoot me a confirmation in the questions tab that you could hear us, that'd be wonderful. Okay, perfect. We're getting some confirmation now. So if you have generic course rating questions during the course of the webinar today, feel free to contact us outside of this webinar directly or at crdbquestions@usga.org. And I will put that email address in the chat for everybody as well. This presentation is scheduled to last 90 minutes today. And we will have breaks for questions between each section. So please feel free to submit any questions you may have in the questions tab and go to webinar during the course of the session. We will address as many as possible, and we will try to get to some at the end of the webinar if time allows for it. We will provide written responses to questions and email them out in the coming days to those that we were unable to answer today as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Scott, who will get us started today. And thank you all for joining us.
All right, thanks, John. So as John mentioned, this is the second in a series of 3. So hopefully everybody on the call either was at the last webinar we did or was able to get the recording of the last webinar that we did and listen to it. So it was on measuring and effective playing length factors. So if you didn't get a chance to tune in the last time or listen in to the recording, it's not a big deal. What we're talking about today is somewhat independent of that. So, and as it says at the top of the screen, this is designed for new and inexperienced course raters, but I know we have probably some people on the line that are, a little bit more advanced than that. So it's not a big deal, but we're going to try to keep it more high level. We're not going to go into too much detail on any particular topic or go into any type of advanced material. So we're going to cover, as it says, topography, fairway, green, target, R&R, and bunkers. So that's going to be the agenda for today. And I'm going to take topography, fairway, and green target, and then Matt's going to come in and relieve me and take R&R and bunkers to kind of wrap it up. So we'll go ahead and get started. And as John mentioned, if you have questions, we're going to have a questions slide at the end of each section just to see what questions popped in. But if you want to write those questions in the questions section of the GoToMeeting menu that you see on your screen there. Okay, so the first one we're going to start with is topography. Probably one of the easier obstacles to rate in terms of the complexity. There's not a lot to it. There's not a ton of it. There's no adjustments actually, and there's just a table value. It does take a little bit of work though, because you have to look at each landing zone. So on a par 5 or 3-shot hole, there's going to be multiple landing zones that have to be evaluated. So as it says, we're looking at the evaluation of the impact of terrain on play. And topography is a factor when slopes or mounds in the landing zones affect stance or lie. What's happening in the rough, what's happening around the green is not going to factor into topography. That's going to go under the R&R obstacle, which Matt's going to talk about later. So we're really just concerned with what's happening in the fairway, and we're really mostly concerned with what's happening in the landing zone, where the player's expected to be on those tee shots and second shots, etc. We also look at the shot to the green and whether it's uphill or downhill. So as you can see in the table on the screen, the two columns on the left are based on whether the shot to the green is uphill or downhill, and how much it is uphill or downhill. So there's plus 10 and minus 10 is the first step above level. So if it's less than 10 feet, we're actually going to treat it as its level. So it has to get to be 10 feet or more before we use something other than the top row of the table. Once you get to 10 feet, then we're going to go ahead and round based on your traditional rounding. So 10 through 14 rounds back down to 10, 15 through 24 rounds up to 20. So just like your traditional rounding we use in math in everyday life typically. So and then on the right side of the table, we have 6 different categories that you can be in for the stance or lie. The first one, just to the right of the downhill column, is really reserved for just par 3 holes. So this would be, when I say reserved for par 3 holes, this would be a par 3 hole that's reachable. So what you have is, for a scratch golfer, by definition, a par 3 hole is a one-shot hole. But for a bogey golfer, they may actually have to hit a second shot to reach a par 3. So a long par 3 that's 220 for the men or 180 for the women, the bogey golfer is going to have to hit a shot from what we would call the fairway or somewhere short of the green. Then that can be applied under one of the 5 other categories, minor through extremely awkward. So really those 5 columns to the right, those are all based on the course rater's judgment call on whether it's a minor problem, a minor to moderate problem, a moderate, a significant, or extremely awkward problem. So these are something that most raters will pick up as they do more and more ratings and learn from some of the experienced people. But for the most part, most courses are going to be in the first 3 categories, minor to moderate, meaning minor to moderate, or moderate. The significantly and extremely awkward columns are not utilized very much. They're they're going to be in place in some courses, but extremely awkward is one of those where we rarely see it, and when you see it, you probably know it. So as I said, there's no adjustments to this category. So essentially, whatever numbers coming off the table is going to be the final number. However, you may have to evaluate multiple landing zones. So what happens is that on a tee shot to a landing zone that is not the approach shot landing zone. So let's say a par 5, the tee shot goes to a tee shot landing zone, but then the next shot is going to go to another landing zone. It's not going to go to the green. Then you would use the very top row of the table. You would use that almost level with fairway row, and then so your maximum rating in that case is 5, because it would be somewhere between 1 and 5. Only on the shot to the green do we look at the uphill or downhill elevation change. So if the fairway on the tee shot to another fairway on a second shot is uphill 10 or 20 feet, we do not use those rows. We do not use a plus 10 or a plus 20 row on shots between fairway landing zones. It's only on the shot to the green. So giving you some examples here of what constitutes some of these stance or lie problems. We have what we would call a minor problem. Some people would say this is no problem. It's pretty flat, almost tabletop flat. But as long as the player has to hit a ball off of the fairway, we're going to give it a minor problem as a minimum rating. So once the player has to hit one shot off of the fairway, no matter how flat it is, we're still going to give it a minimum rating of 1. Obviously, most fairways are not going to be tabletop flat. Secondly, it's also about the lie of the ball, not just about the stance. So there could be small depressions, there could be some issues with the turf, things like that. So it's never a good idea to give a 0, and you should never give a 0 to a par 4, par 5 hole for topography. The second category is minor to moderate. So it's what we used to refer to as a tweener. It's a category that essentially says that the fairway area, the fairway landing zone, is not truly minor, but it's not enough to be fully moderate either. So sometimes, two-dimensional pictures don't show the undulation very well, but on this particular hole, to the left side of the hole, it's pretty flat. But as you get closer to the right side, kind of where some of those divots are, and a little bit in front of those divots right on the right side, you start to see some undulation, start to see a little bit of movement in the fairway. So this could be a case where maybe you would use a minor to moderate problem. So it's somewhere between, minor and moderate in the category. And then moderate, the full moderate, as you can see here, there's very little flat area, but it's not terrible. It's gentle slopes up and down. There's not anything super severe. So the player's going to have an awkward stance or lie, but not terribly awkward. So it's definitely more of a moderate problem. This could not be a minor problem, and even minor to moderate, it's a little bit low. So this would be an example of a moderate problem with stance or lie. And then a significant problem is where you have maybe a little bit more steep or pronounced changes in elevation here on the fairway, where the ball might be sitting 6 inches or a foot below somebody's stance, or the ball sits way high on a slope, and you have to kind of adjust the stance and the grip on the club to really hit a shot that's going to try to go straight there. So it's really the impact of topography on the player's ability to play the shot. So if the ball's flat and the stance is flat, that's going to be as minor as it gets. But once the player has to potentially deal with uphill, downhill, side hill stances or lies of the ball, then we start to ratchet up the ratings. I don't have an example of extreme. Like I said, it's pretty rare to come up with an extremely awkward stance lie. It's usually those kind of holes. The ball doesn't stay at rest on those extreme lies, or those extreme slopes. So I haven't found a picture through my travels around the golfing world to show an extreme example, but it is there if ever needed. So just going to do a couple quick examples of topography. First one is a par 3 hole, so you'll kind of get a feel for how a par 3 hole works. And I'm not sure how many people on the call here have their books in front of them or have access to the book, but if you do, you can obviously follow along in the book as we go through here. So under topography, as you can see, we have a couple informational pieces at the bottom, which is a tee to green downhill 25 feet, which, just like elevation, we're going to round that to the nearest 10-foot increment. So this is going to actually go into the topography approach elevation change as 30 feet. It is a par 3 hole, so we're going to use that par 3 column in terms of the topography table. So we have a -30 approach elevation change and a par 3 stance or lie problems. Now, obviously, this is a par 3 hole I didn't put it on the screen, but it's a very short one. This is obviously a hole that many people might recognize from Pebble Beach, hole number 7. It's only about 140 yards at maximum. So it's a reachable hole by pretty much every golfer, men, women, scratch and bogey. So both players have the same approach elevation change. The -30 is the same for both. So when we go to our table here, we're going to use that par 3 hole column right there in the middle of the table almost. And then we're going to use the -30 downhill row. And that's going to give us a table value for topography of 3. So that's going to be our final number because, again, there's no adjustments, and also there's only a single shot. There's no multiple landing zones on this hole as it's a par 3. So par 3 holes are pretty simple in terms that you really are only looking at elevation change. And again, it has to be 10 feet or more to qualify. However, there might be some par 3 holes, again, where the bogey golfer can't reach the green in one shot, and you have to go to another category under the stance or lie problems. But also, it might also mean that you have a different elevation change. So what might have been a 30-foot drop from the tee for the scratch golfer, if this hole was long enough, might be 0 for the bogey golfer because their tee shot winds up kind of closer to level with the green. So it can go both directions in that case. All right, second example, which is going to be more common, is on your par 4s or par 5s where you're hitting a shot in, or the golfer's hitting a shot in from the fairway into the green. So as you can see, this fairway tilts pretty heavy from right to left. So it's a lot lower on the left side of the fairway than on the right. So we're going to go ahead and call this a full moderate stance and lie problem. And the approach shot in this case is uphill 20 feet. So again, we will go to our table. Now we're just going to do the example here for scratch. On par 4s and par 5s, you're typically coming in from a different distance and a different approach shot for scratch and bogey. So it's sometimes hard in seminars like this to show both players in the same case because you have to have 2 different landing zones. But we're going to go ahead and just do it for scratch in this case as an example. So it's a +20 approach elevation change, moderate stance and lie problems. So again, we're going to go to the moderately awkward column for stance and lie, and we're going to use the +20 on uphill approach elevation, and that's going to give us a 5 for our rating. Now, if this was a par 4 hole or a 2-shot hole, meaning they're only hitting 1 shot in the fairway, this would be the final rating. If this was a par 5 hole or a 3-shot hole, there might have been another landing zone that generated a different value. But with topography, we're always going to take the highest rated landing zone or the highest rated value. So if the tee shot to a landing zone was a 3, then the shot to the green later was a 5, the final rating for topography would still be 5. We don't average ratings in this case. We don't take a 5 and a 3 and become a 4. We always take the higher of the 2 or 3. There could potentially be 3 full landing zones prior to a shot to the green, although that would have to be a fairly long hole for a bogey or a man or a woman. So, okay, any questions, John, that have popped up on topography as we've gone through?
No questions on topography, Scott.
Okay, good. And that was kind of expected. It's, like I said, one of the easier obstacles to evaluate because there's only just a table and it's really only two values that you can measure pretty easily. Okay, our next category, obstacle factor, is fairway. This one does have a little bit more going on than topography. We're going to have the fairway table, but we're also going to have a number of adjustments that can apply because not every situation is the same. So with fairway, we're looking at the evaluation of keeping the ball in the fairway from tee to green. So the fairway ratings are based on the width of the fairway and all landing zones. So if there's one landing zone, it's based on that single landing zone. But if there are multiple landing zones, like a par 5 or 3-shot hole, we're going to evaluate each landing zone separately. And again, we're going to use the highest rating we come up with in that case. We also look at the hole length. The length of the hole is a big driver of the fairway number. The longer the hole is, the more important it is to hit the fairway. Hitting a wedge or a 9-iron out of the rough is a little bit easier than hitting a 3-iron or a hybrid out of the rough. So, the length of the hole will factor into the fairway rating. And then any nearby trees or obstacles or punitive rough that might make the fairway play narrower or wider than it measures. So the first thing we typically do when we get to a landing zone is measure the fairway width. And I assume most people on this webinar will know that we have these distances we use for the scratch golfer, the bogey golfer, men and women, that we go out to our fairway landing zones. The one thing about that is it's not a specific point. It's not, for example, the scratch mill golfer 250 off the tee is the average, distance we're going to go. It doesn't mean you go right to 250 and that becomes the only point to measure the fairway. We're going to look at the entire landing zone, which is where the ball comes down and where it stops after roll. So in most cases, it's going to be 20 yards. So at sea level and on a flat hole, it's going to be, for a scratch mill golfer, 230. The ball hits the ground, it rolls out to 250. So we're going to look at the fairway width in that entire area between 230 and 250, not just at 250. Most times it doesn't make a big difference, especially holes that are very, very straight, where the fairway doesn't have a contour cut, doesn't kind of move in and out. So a hole in front of you that you see on the screen, it's going to be the same whether you're at 230 or 250, or if you're rating for women, 210 or 190 are the two numbers for the women. However, if you have holes where the fairway is contour cut, where it gets wider and narrower as it goes down the hole, kind of like the image I showed on the previous screen, then you're going to have to look at the average of those two measurements or the entire width of the fairway. So the other thing on this hole that you'll notice is that there's a a second cut or an intermediate cut. A lot of courses will have that, where it's that cut between the fairway and the rough. Usually it's 1 or 2 yards wide on each side. We treat that as half fairway and half rough. So what that means is that we're going to measure the fairway not just to the very edge of where the fairway cut is, but we're going to include 50% of both sides in that case, or 100% of one side. So if it's 2 yards on both sides of the fairway with that intermediate strip of cut, we're going to use 2 total yards extra fairway width. So it's 4 yards total, 2 yards on each side, but we're going to use half of that value. So it's going to be an extra 2 yards added to the width of the fairway. Now, once we have our fairway width, we're going to have to start plugging it into our table value. And our table value is going to be based, again, on the length of the hole. Now, the length of the hole doesn't change by landing zone. So if you have multiple landing zones, you're still going to use the same row on the left or the right side of the table, which is the length of the hole for men on the right, as on the left, and then the right, it's the length of the hole for women. So this table does have both men's and women's values in it. Other tables we're going to see later today are going to have separate tables for men and women. But this one has the same table used for men and women, but it is entered from a different side for men than it is for women. In the middle columns is where your fairway widths are. So if the fairway width, for example, was 32, you're going to use the column that says 30 to 34, and then you're going to find the length of the hole for men or women, whoever you're rating for, and that's going to give you your fairway value. If there are multiple landing zones, you're going to evaluate each one separately, come up with a table value, come up with any adjustments that are there, and then find the one that gives you the highest rating. So adjustments for the most part in fairway are shot specific. So what that means is that you may have an adjustment that applies just on the tee shot landing zone, but it doesn't apply on another landing zone, maybe on a long par 5. You would only apply that adjustment to the table value from the tee shot landing zone in that case. So we have an example later that I can explain that a little bit better. Now this table does have what we used to call tweeners, or we still call tweeners, which is a formally defined definition in the system. As you can see there are times when a number jumps 2 points. So if you go from 25 to 29 yard wide fairway down to 20 to 24, the numbers actually go from 3 to 5, 4 to 6, and 5 to 7 in those 3 bottom rows. So that number in between, which would be a 4, a 5, and a 6, are not on the table. So we have these what we call tweeners. It's a number that can be used if the measurement is pretty much right on the line, or right on that, we call it tweener. So if the fairway width is exactly 25 or exactly 24, where you're just 1 yard from being in one category or the other, it would be a good case to use that tweener value that sits between those two table values. So one other thing is that not all measuring devices are going to line up with exactly the same numbers each time you use it. So you could take your laser and you could shoot across the fairway and it says 24. And then you realize, well, maybe I wasn't fully in the underside of the fairway. And I measured a second time and it comes out as 25. So I'm not quite sure whether 24 or 25 is the right number anyways. So that would be a good case again to use a tweener. So they're not required. Obviously if a fairway is 24 and it's 24, if you use the 20 to 24 column, you're not wrong. But the tweener value is there to kind of account for those times when it's not quite in one category or the other. And there will be other tables that have the same concept built in. So under fairway, the most common adjustment that's going to be applied is the width adjustment. And the width adjustment is really a series of adjustments. It's the same adjustment, but it has many reasons to use it. So as you can see here, and I didn't have everyone laid out here, but it says width +1, so we're going to add 1 point to the table value if the fairway width is effectively reduced by a dog leg, overhanging tree branches, contour or tilt, so the shot must be played to one side, or severe obstacles on one side. So in those pictures you see on the screen, each one of those kind of shows a situation where you might apply a +1. So on that upper right picture, it's a dog leg. The player, if they cut the dog leg, kind of play it over that cart path, they're really not playing it down the center of the fairway. They're playing it a lot more to the left side of the hole, and that makes the fairway, in that case, a little bit tougher to hit. The player has a lot of room to the right, but not a whole lot of room at all to the left if they somehow miss it. So as opposed to hitting the ball right down the middle of the fairway where you have the maximum maximum ability to miss the middle, left and right. On the bottom left is a hole which could be applied in a couple different categories. One is it's overhanging tree branches. On the right side of the hole, you can see that there are some trees that might restrict a player from reaching certain parts of the fairway if the ball goes that far. Or it could just be under the severe obstacles category of dense trees. Most people would look at that and say those are pretty dense. So the player is going to have to, play away from those trees, especially on the left, to just to keep the ball in the fairway. And then the bottom right picture is where the fairway is tilted to the point where the player has to play probably to the very right edge of the fairway to keep the ball from rolling out of the fairway into the rough on the left-hand side. So this is obviously an extreme example. You're not going to see holes like this very often, but it's not uncommon in areas that have a lot of hills and hilly golf courses to have holes where the fairway kind of pushes the ball out of the fairway into the rough for part or most of the fairway width. So in those cases, we can apply a +1 adjustment. There's also a -1 adjustment that is exactly the opposite, where something's helping the ball keep in the fairway when otherwise it might not. So we're always going to use the table based on the actual width of the fairway. So if the fairway is 28 yards wide, we're going to start with that number for the fairway table value. However, these adjustments say, in this case, something is effectively increased by hillsides or mounding closely bordering the fairway. So in this case, if a ball hits up on the right side, up in those mounds, or maybe on the left side, up in the mounds, there's a good chance it's going to bounce back down at the fairway. So even though the fairway is, narrow at 28 yards, which is probably more average, it's actually effectively wider. A ball that hits 3, 4, 5 yards either side of this fairway is very likely to kick back into the fairway. So it's effectively wider than it looks, or wider than it measures. So again, not a common situation, but I'm sure everybody here has played a golf course or rated a golf course where you have the fairways where they're kind of like a bowl, where the ball hits up in the hills and the rough and it winds up kicking back into the fairway as often as it doesn't. So we can take away points in that case, or take away a point. So there's other adjustments under fairway. I'm not going to go through all of them. We'd be here for a lot longer than 90 minutes today if we went through all the adjustments for each of these obstacles. So just hit a couple of them that are pretty common. So we're going to go into a example for fairway, and this is really going to be about the table value and making sure we understand the how to rate fairway from the table value perspective. So we have a hole that's 430 yards for the men and 370 for the women. So that number in the brackets is based on women's yardage. So we have the landing zone for the bogey that's out there where probably the fattest part of the fairway is at 42 yards. So we're going to go ahead on our rating form and write in 42 yards as our landing zone width. Our scratch golfer is obviously farther up the hole, and that's going to be a little bit narrower. Fairway pinches a little bit, kind of right around that 34 marker, or that 34-yard wide fairway. So we're going to put in 34 at the scratch landing zone width. And for those of you that are brand new or haven't rated any courses or very, very inexperienced, we do write down both the scratch and the bogey numbers, and the scratch numbers are always on the left side of the form, and the bogey numbers are on the right. So the 34 is for scratch and the 42 is for bogey. This hole is long enough where the bogey golfer cannot reach it in 2 shots. So 370 for the men and 280 for the women is your standard 2-shot distance for bogey, and obviously this hole's longer than that, so they're going to have an additional landing zone there short of the green, where the fairway narrows up to about 26 yards wide on average. So our bogey golfer has a second landing zone at 26. So we're going to go to our table and figure out what our fairway rating values are. So as this is a single shot hole for the, so when I say single shot, it's a 1 shot in the fairway hole for the scratch golfer. We only have to go to the table once. So we'll go to the table at the top. 30 to 34 is our width of our fairway, and our hole length is over 425 for men and over 355 for women. So it's the bottom row, and that's going to give us a 4 off the chart. So that's right almost in the middle of the table, middle left of the table, bottom of it. So, however, the bogey golfer has 2 fairway landing zones. First one being 42. Again, we're going to use the bottom row because the hole length is the same whether it's a scratch or a bogey player. So we're going to go ahead to the 35 to 45 column, and that's going to give us a 3 off the table. However, the second shot that is much narrower is 26, and when we go there on the table between 25 and 29, that gives us a 5 off the bottom of the table. And as I said earlier, if we have multiple fairway landing zones, we're going to take the one that generates the highest rating. So a 3 on the tee shot, a 5 on the second shot, winds up with a final rating of 5 for the bogey golfer. So hopefully that pops up here. There it is. So that's pretty much how we rate fairway from the table. If there are adjustments in play, like a width adjustment or other adjustments that are in the system, those are going to apply to the landing zone where they come into play. So for example, let's say that on the 26-yard wide fairway landing zone for the bogey second, let's say that there are hillsides on both sides of the fairway that kick the ball back into the fairway for 4 or 5 yards on each side. That value of 5 then would be reduced to a 4, because 5 minus the 1 for the W equals a 4, and that would still be the higher of the 2 values and wind up as a 4. But if the width minus 1 adjustment was applied to the 42-yard landing zone, where the first tee shot was, that value would go from 3 to 2, but it wouldn't affect the second shot value of 5. So That's where we don't want to see an adjustment applied to a landing zone incorrectly by applying it to the entire hole value. So in this case, the higher value is the second one. So what's happening on the tee shot landing zone really shouldn't impact the full value based on the second landing zone because that's the higher of the two. So hopefully that makes sense. But again, as these inexperienced raters and newer raters that are on the webinar here today, this is something you really learn as you rate courses and you're out there with rating teams and team leaders that can help develop the rater. Okay, any questions on fairway, John?
2 questions for you, Scott.
Go ahead.
If you have more than one adjustment factor on a hole, such as an overhanging tree and a slope, what would you do in that situation?
It's still just a singular adjustment of +1. I know that logically that might not make sense to somebody to say, well, if it has a slope or overhanging trees, it's a +1. If it has both, all of a sudden can it be a so? And there is a secondary adjustment as well that we can apply. There's a +2 adjustment based on the fairway tilt. So some of them do have more than 1 point available, but it has to meet that criteria. It can't be 2 of the same adjustments, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. And another question, for fairway width, can you measure to the middle of the landing zone instead of the front and the middle?
You could, so that's actually not an uncommon practice where people would just say, let's just go to the midpoint of this landing zone and let's measure it, and that becomes kind of like the average, which works most of the time. But let's say that the beginning of the landing zone is 20, and it's a really sharp or it widens out really quickly. So it goes from 20 to 40, which would be a pretty wide fairway for that short of a distance in change in distance. The average would be 30 if you use the 2 numbers and average them. If you go to the midpoint, it may not be 30. Maybe it widens more at the end of the landing zone than at the beginning. So maybe it's like 26, at halfway through landing zone, and then it widens really a lot more after that. So, but either way, you're going to get a pretty good number. We don't need to be that technical where we get the exact average, because somebody could drive themselves nuts saying, well, it's 30 at the beginning, it's 40 at the end, 35. Easy. If you start to pick it apart and say, well, it's gradual at the beginning and it's very severe at the end. Let's use a bigger average than that. You could drive yourself nuts. So really, just the pure average is good enough for the most part. Any last questions there, John?
Nope, that's all for now, Scott.
Okay. All right, moving along, and this will be the last obstacle that I'll cover. Then I'll turn it over to Matt here. And this one is a little bit more involved. Green target is probably the most important obstacle rating to determine during the process. The reason I say that is that it helps drive the ratings for the next 2 categories, which is R&R and bunkers. So getting the green target incorrect will actually impact 2 other obstacles on top of it. So we really want to make sure we get a good green target rating to make sure the other 2 ratings are as accurate as possible as well. So with green target, we're evaluating the hitting the green with the approach shot. So as you can see in this hole, it's a par 3 hole, but it's a small green. It's a fairly long shot. It's going to usually lead to a high green target rating. So as it says, green target ratings are based on the size of the green, the approach shot length, and any type of green surface visibility issues or firmness that might make that green play smaller or smaller than it looks, I should say. So this is the table, like I mentioned earlier, that has 2 separate tables for men and women. So men and women have a different table. Their shot lengths are going to be different. Their approach shot lengths are going to be different. So we couldn't have a singular table without making it too complex. So we have a separate table for men and one for women. Yellow is the table for men, obviously, and blue, or sorry, yellow is for women and blue is for men. The columns across the middle of the table that have the numbers 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, those are what we would call the effective diameters of the green. So those numbers underneath it, greater than 31, 27 to 31, etc. That is the range of the effective diameter of the green. And I'm going to talk about that here in a few minutes. But we determine the effective diameter of the green as the green size. And whatever category that fits into is what columns used in this particular table. And then we look at the approach shot length. So as you can see, for either men or women, the scratch golfer comes in from the left side and the bogey golfer comes in from the right side. So they're more often than not are going to have different approach shots. The only time where scratch and bogey typically have the same approach shot is on a par 3 hole that's reachable, or there could be a hole that's a par 4, par 5, where due to layups or other things that are in play, you might have the same, approach shot for scratch and bogey, but usually it means it's one extra shot for bogey to get there. So it might be a third shot for bogey that's the same as a second shot for scratch coming into the green. So it's a pretty big table, but really once you've selected your green size, your effective diameter, you're really just choosing from the numbers in one particular column. You'll notice that there's a row at the very bottom, or some expanded row, I should say, that talks about 50-50 transition zone. We'll talk about that here in about 5 minutes, because that's a kind of a little bit more complex concept outside of the normal green target rating table value. So we'll talk through that first. So the first thing we typically do when we get to a green is measure the green. And what we do is we determine the effective green diameter. And all we're doing is taking the average in general of the width and the depth of the green. Diameter, as you know, is a term that's affiliated with a circle. So we're essentially saying this green here at 32 yards wide and 26 yards deep is about the size of a 29-yard circle. So we're essentially giving every green a diameter based on how big it would be if it were a circle. Most greens will fit into this category where you can just take the average of the width and the depth and you get a number, and that's your effective diameter. You're going to have certain greens that have to be done a little differently. There's a whole page in the course rating guide that talks about oddly shaped greens where they don't have a circular pattern at all. Maybe it's more of a donut shape, or not a donut, but maybe like a kidney bean shaped, where it's maybe a little bit different width on one side of the green than the other. And then there's some averaging involved. But in general, using the average of the width and the depth is going to be probably 50 to 75% of the time is going to work. Now, some greens are circular in shape in general, but they're elongated. They're not necessarily, they're more rectangular, more like an oval. If the green gets to the point where it's more than 2 times one dimension than the other, we can no longer use the average of the width and the depth. So we have a green here that's 30 yards wide and 14 yards deep. We can't just say, okay, it's 44 divided by 2 is 22, that's our number. These greens are putting a premium on one direction or one dimension more than the other. So most shot patterns are fairly circular, and that's one of the reasons we use effective diameter as the primary measurement. Is that a shot coming to the green is going to be, for the most part, circular. It's going to have kind of a shot pattern that's wide and also deep that's going to be fairly similar. It's a little bit wider than it is deep in general, but in this case, once you get to be more than 2 times one dimension as the other, and it doesn't matter which one's which, we're going to use a weighted average. So we're going to use 2 of the shorter dimension. So in this case, 2 14s. We're going to add the one longer dimension, which is 30, and then we're going to divide it all by 3. So we're weighting it 2 to 1, short versus long, and it winds up as a 19 effective green diameter. So even though this green would be 22 as a circular green, if those 2 dimensions were just average, it plays a little bit smaller. There's a much bigger premium on this green to hit the ball, especially front to back, than a green that would be 22 yards of more of a circle. So these aren't super common, but some courses have quite a few of these. I've rated a few courses where there might be 9 or 10 greens on the golf course that are 2 to 1. Some architects really like the design feature of having very narrow long greens, or skinny and long greens, depending on which direction it is. So these are going to come into play, at some point for every rater on some golf course. We also have a procedure that goes into place if there's a green that's more than 3 times one dimension than the other. This is pretty rare. In fact, it's hard to even find greens like this sometimes for examples, but there are some out there. I think this is from Muirfield Village in Ohio, in Columbus area, where it's only 12 yards wide and 40 yards deep. So it's more than 3 times one dimension as the other. Same concept. We're going to use 3 times of the shorter value of 12, 1 of the longer value of 40, divide it all by 4, and again come up with a weighted average, in this case, of 19. So even though this green is very large in terms of looking at it and its square footage, it plays very difficult in terms of the hitting area. The player really only has 12 yards to play with left and right and keep the ball in the green. So it's putting a premium on the player hitting the ball very straight. So it's a much smaller green effectively than it looks. Again, not something you're going to see very often on a rating. One of the more common adjustments that a rating team is going to see, especially in courses that have some hills on them, is going to be visibility, where this typically happens when a shot's uphill and the green's fairly level or maybe even slightly downsloped, where the rating team can't see the surface of the green. We have two points available for visibility. The first one would be a +1 if less than half the green surface is visible. So if from the landing zone to the green, the rating team or the rater cannot see at least half the green, we can apply a +1 adjustment to green target. So you get the green target off the table, let's say it's a 4, can't see half the green, you apply an extra point, becomes a 5. A second point would be added, or 2 total points, if the green is blind. And when we say blind, we're talking about the top of the flagstick is not visible. So in the picture on the screen, you can see the flagstick. You know where the green is. If you hit the ball at that flagstick, it's probably going to be on the green because they're not going to put the flagstick at the very edge of the green either side. However, if you can't see a flagstick at all and you have no reference point where the green's edge is or where a good aim point would be to get the ball in the green, we're going to add 2 points in that scenario. That usually only happens on a very steep, uphill holes where it's a shorter shot to an uphill green where the entire green is not visible. So not again common, but visibility, the +1 visibility, in some parts of the country can be quite common. You could have half a dozen holes on a golf course that have a visibility adjustment, would not be out of the question. Okay, and then transition zone is, like I mentioned earlier, one of the more complex procedures, although we did make an effort to make this easier in 2020. So the current book that we have was revised in 2020 to go along with the World Handicap System launch. And we did address transition zone to try to make it a little bit easier to apply and a little bit more consistent. But the concept itself is where some people get a little lost. But essentially what we have here is a buffer. We're adding another 10 yards to a tee shot and another 20 yards to 2 or more shot holes to say the player can reach these holes, but not consistently, not every time. So we have our standard distances that players hit the ball. So like I mentioned earlier, 250 for the scratch male and 210 for the scratch female, and then their second shot goes to 470 for the men and 400 for the women. That's the scratch. Now, as you look at this transition zone table, you can see that we extend that another 10 yards. So for the men, it goes from 251 to 260, and for women, 211 to 220. So it's 10 yards beyond their normal single shot distance. And then their 2-shot distance that normally is 470 for men and 400 for women goes out to 490 for men and 420 for women. And the bogey golfer has the same exact concept. We're going to add 10 yards to their tee shot and then 20 yards to 2 or more shots. It doesn't add an extra 10 yards per shot. It doesn't go up 30 yards and 40 yards as we get farther down. It just adds a total of 20 yards, whether it's a second, third, or fourth shot. Knowing that it's pretty rare for a player to hit a little bit beyond their average 3 or 4 times in a row. So that's kind of the concept of transition, is that players can hit the ball longer than their average, but they just wouldn't do it on a regular basis, kind of the concept of the average term. So on a hole where a long shot can barely reach the center of the green, the rating for green target is going to be a high number. If we go back to that green target table, when a player is hitting that max distance into the green, the rating is going to be 4, 6, 8, 10, somewhere in that range. Usually it's going to be somewhere between 6 and 10. On a long shot that doesn't reach the center of the green. So let's say a player hits all they have in their bag and they wind up just short of the green, and they have a little pitch shot remaining. The green target then is going to be very low because they have a little pitch shot to the green as opposed to a long shot, which is going to be normally a 2 off the table. So instead of having raters make a decision on whether it's going to be a 2 or be something up in the 7, 8, 9 range, we have a transition zone where it allows them to use somewhat of an average between the two. So as it says, when the hole falls between these two extremes, an intermediate value between the long and the short target ratings is determined. And we use that transition zone concept. Now, one thing I will mention, because I'm sure there's people on this call that live and rate at altitudes above 2,000 feet, These numbers that are on the screen and some of the numbers I've been referencing are sea level or up to 2,000 foot, up to 1,999, I guess, altitude above sea level. Once the altitude is 2,000 feet or higher, shot lengths are actually increased. They go farther for 3 of the 4 players, for scratch, both men and women, and for bogey, just for the men. So these numbers actually are increased at altitude to reflect the ball traveling farther in the thin air. So, but those who rate at altitude are going to learn that pretty quickly when they look at their book and their charts and their forums that have different numbers than what you're seeing on the screen here. So the transition zone, like I mentioned earlier, is at the bottom of the green target rating table. And what that is, it just represents the average of what would be the long shot and the short shot averaged together. So if we look at like the first table on the left, the women's table for the greater than 31 column, 5 is the bottom number and 2 is the top. 2's less than 30 and 5 is greater than 200. That equals 7. We divide it by 2, it equals 3.5, and we rounded. We did the rounding for you, which is 4. So as you can see that there's only 3 choices for transition zone. It's 4, 5, or 6 off the table. And that's because the average between the top row and the bottom row of the table is going to give you those 3 choices. However, we do allow a team to adjust that value by 1 point, plus or minus. So that would be based on whether the center of the green is close to the front or back of the transition zone. The other thing, and again, this is where it gets a little complex, a hole that's in transition on paper that looks like it will be a hole that they normally couldn't reach every time but might be able to reach some of the time, it actually could fall out of transition. What that means is that they can never reach it or maybe always reach it based on effective playing length adjustments. And those of you that attended the webinar we did before under effective playing length, things like roll, elevation, layups, dog legs, these things can all affect how long of an approach shot the player has into the green, which might change the hole from a transition hole out of transition. So, for example, if you have a 380-yard hole for men or 290 for women, that would be right in the smack middle of the bogey transition distance. That's 10 yards into transition for a bogey golfer out of their total of 20 yards of potential transition. However, if that hole was 30 or 40 feet uphill, where the player's losing 5 or 10 yards in the tee shot because they're hitting up a slope, then they're going uphill again, that would be a case where you may say they never get there. They're not going to gain extra distance going uphill compared to their normal shot. So now it becomes just a 3-shot hole as opposed to a transition hole. And the opposite applies as well. A hole that's not in transition can actually get into transition based on effective playing length adjustments. So a hole that normally is unreachable in 2 shots might be reachable if the hole's downhill or the hole has excessive roll. Maybe they land on a downslope and they get an extra 10 or 15 yards of roll. Now that hole becomes reachable as opposed to unreachable, and it could fall into transition. So again, this is probably one of the most complex parts of the course rating system. It's something that most raters will learn as they go, learn as they rate holes and rate courses, just listening and learning from the experienced people. But it's something that it's gonna happen. I mean, on most courses, you're gonna have a handful of holes that are in transition. They happen to be pretty common length holes. I mean, we're talking about a bogey golfer for men, especially 370, 390 is a pretty sweet spot for a lot of holes on a golf course from maybe the commonly played set of tees. And for women, that 280 to 300 is a pretty common. So you might have 5, 6 holes that are in transition for bogey, and maybe a few for men for scratch, or women for scratch as well. So we're going to go ahead and do a quick example for green target, and this is not going to involve transition. So we have a hole that some of you might recognize, 17th hole at TPC Sawgrass. Not a long hole by any means, 137 yards. We're just going to go ahead and rate for the men just to keep it simple here in this case, but the rating process is the same whether it's men or women. The green diameter is 23. This green is actually 26 wide by 20 deep, so it averages out to 23. And as you can see, it's pretty circular, so we're going to use that 23. So when we go to the form, we have an approach shot length for both scratch and bogey of 137. Because both players can reach the green in one shot, they both have the same approach shot to the green. However, their table value is not going to be the same because, as you can see on the table on the upper left, that the 137 range is different for the men, or sorry, different for the scratch than it is for the bogey. So the 137 falls into the 120 to 139 row for scratch, but it falls into the 130 to 149 for bogey, which is a few rows down. So when we go to the table, the value is going to be for scratch a 4. And again, that's using the 22 to 26 column that has the number 4 on the top of it. And we move that down to the 120 to 139. Maybe you can see my cursor here, but the 4 is for the scratch. And then for the bogey, we're using the same column, but we're moving down a few rows to get to the 130 to 149 shot length, and that's going to be a 5. So even though it's the same length shot for scratch and bogey, the bogey green target rating is going to be higher, and that's just common sense. They're going to have a more difficult shot even though it's the same distance because they're a bogey golfer and not a scratch golfer. Okay, like I said earlier, we're not going to go into too much detail about it, some of the things that don't happen very often in the rating process. So any questions that have popped up here, John, for green target?
Yeah, for green target, what if the shot is short of the green center but is on the green?
Yeah, like I said, I didn't want to get too much into detail about the process of transition because it could be a 20-minute seminar by itself. But what we do in that case, if it gets on the green but doesn't reach the center, you have to determine whether it has a chance to reach the center. So at 370 to 390 for the bogey male or 280 to 300 for the bogey female, let's use that as an example. Mathematically, that probably puts the ball in the green most of the time. Unless the green's excessively small, there's a good chance the ball is actually going to wind up on the green surface up to that full transition zone. But it has to reach the center of the green for us to call it reachable. And that's a key point, is that measurements, for those who attended our last webinar, measurements are made to the center of the green. So when we're talking about a player reaching the green, we need to make sure they can reach the center of the green, because then they played the hole at the length that it was measured. If a ball rolls on the first couple of yards of the green and stops, even though it might be on the green surface, we're going to say they didn't reach the green. They didn't reach the center. So that would be a case where you might say they're going to get there less than half the time and use a value below the 50-50. So like I said, we could spend another 20 minutes talking about just transition, but it's something that I don't think we're going to get a lot of bang out of our buck for talking transition with a more beginner and inexperienced group here. So, any other questions, John?
That's all. We're good to move on to the next section.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and I'm going to switch my controls here so that he has the mouse control. Hopefully that works for him. Matt, can you control the mouse right now?
Not so far. So if you want to try and go ahead.
Let me try it again. I'll give it okay. Try one more time. Okay.
There we go.
So Matt's going to take you through the rest of the seminar here, and then we're going to kind of wrap up with questions that we can both answer if needed.
All right, thanks, Scott, and really good job explaining those first 3 topics. Good afternoon, everyone. The first topic that I'm going to talk about is recoverability in rough, or the shorthand way we talk about this is R&R, just to keep with brevity for sakes. To rate R&R, we're going to use the average height of the rough adjacent to the fairway and green, excluding any narrow intermediate cut that may exist, right? Scott talked about that during the fairway. That's where that's getting measured. Most of what we have discussed to this point are what is in the fairway or on the green. These R&R values that we're going to discuss now are for everything that are on the outskirts of the rough and the landing zones, as well as around the greens, excluding those greenside bunkers. Scott talked through earlier topography, sort of what happens in the landing zone regarding terrain. The R&R values are sort of the outskirts, within the landing zone, what's happening in the rough, and as well as at the green, what's happening around the green. It's what is it going to take for this player to recover if they do miss the fairway or do miss the center of the green. So R&R is an evaluation of the probability of missing the fairway landing zones and the green, and the difficulty of recovering if any are missed, right? The R&R values are based on green target rating values, like Scott mentioned earlier, the type and height of rough grass, the rise and drop around the green, mounding adjacent to fairway landing zones or at the green, other rough conditions such as sand dunes, waste areas, brush, ice plant, and the rest of those, and any difference in any of the rough in a specific landing zone compared to the average rough height of the hole. Green target values set the baseline for R&R values and bunkers, and we'll certainly get into bunkers next. The types of grasses that we look at while rating R&R are warm or cool season type grasses. Within the guide under R&R, you will see within the table that warm season grass lengths are embraces, and as we progress through the program here, you'll see that within the guide. Most of you on this webinar pretty much know what type of grass that you'll have in your area of the country just based on the geography. If there's any question if the grass is a warm or a cold season, certainly consulting with the AGA, the rating captain, or the team lead is always a good choice. There are examples as to which grass types are warm and cold season within the course rating guide. R&R tables and adjustments. Oop, went a little too far there. Scott, can you go back for me? I'm not sure I'm able to. There we go. Okay, thank you. I must have clicked a little too much. So the R&R table values are on the left-hand side for both men and women. Like Scott mentioned in the green target table, this is another table that separates men from women. Men are still in blue, women are still in yellow. Notice that the baseline starts with the green target value, which starts out with scratch on the left side and bogey on the right side. The warm season grasses within the center of the table there, the 1 inch, the 1 to 2 inch for men, or 1.5 to 1 to 1.5 for women. Those are in the braces. So the braces that you see within that table, within the guide, are your warm season grasses. R&R you see on the right-hand side has the most adjustments out of any obstacle factor. And you can see a laundry list of them right there on the right-hand side. And that's not even all of them. There's also another one that you got a sneak peek of on the next slide there. Certainly some of the most common ones you'll see are the I adjustments, the M adjustment for mounds, and the 3 adjustments for bogey only. And when we talk about the mounds adjustment, it's probably the most popular, I would say. The +1 says if mounds or hollows are present near the fairway landing zone, consider their severity, number, and location. Near is one of those course rating terms that means within 20 yards of that fairway landing zone, or if there's significant mounds near the green and is closely bordered by grass mounds or hollows, and or the rise and drop is greater than 5, there's another +1 adjustment. And then we're going to exclude bunkers on that factor. The reason why we're going to exclude that rise and drop of greater than 5 when there's bunkers around, when we're looking at a significant portion, is when we talk about bunkers, that'll be applied to what the depth is of that. So we're not going to do what we call double dipping in course rating right there. And then you can see the rest of the language there with mounds there. Within the M adjustment, you see the word significant portion of the green when we're talking about that rise and drop of 5 or 10 feet. And when we talk about that, certainly, the proximity or location as to where that rise and drop is certainly impacts it. When we talk through course rating, less than 10% of shots ever get to the back of the green. So we place a little less importance behind the green as we do as the player's approaching the hole to the center of the green. So certainly if there's a rise and drop, that's significant on the front third, on either the left or right side, it may be a little more impactful in something that's behind the green. So that's what we talk about, significant portions. If golf balls are going to be hit and miss that green, we're going to miss it, and how they'll be impacted. and certainly leaning on your veteran raters, your captains, the staff at the AGA, the Golf Association will certainly help with that. You know, another adjustment that we talk about is the surround adjustment. And I only mention that because it's actually something that you'll need to look at when you look at a future category or obstacle factor, which is the lateral obstacles. Under lateral, we have an adjustment called surround, and not to get too detailed in it because we'll touch on it the next session, but you know, if we look at a hole that Scott had mentioned with the green target, that sawgrass hole, number 17, you know, it's surrounded by water. So there's no recoverability from that. You either hit the green or you miss the green and you're probably in the water. So what that is it's an adjustment under R&R to really bump it up to say, hey, you can't really recover from it, so the point value should be higher. So based on the proximity from the edge of the green as to, you know, where the water is and what percentage it's surrounded, you know, that's where that surrounded adjustment gets applied. So certainly something we'll talk about in the future, but wanted to make mention of that. And then the last one I'll make mention of on this slide is under the bogey ratings only, is the 3 adjustment of +1. If that bogey player cannot reach the center of the green of a par 3 hole in one shot, or lays up and the area short of the green is at least 20 yards wide, we're going to add +1. And then same thing, the area short of the green is less than 20 yards wide, and the cut is to fairway height, and it's cut to fairway height, or no such fairway is available. You're just hitting into rough. We're going to add +2 on there. So very common, especially on those long par 3s that Scott mentioned. You know, maybe 225 yards for men or 185 for women. You know, that bogey player for each gender can't get to the center of the green, just outside of transition there. You know, by 15 or so yards, you're obviously going to need to use that and help bump up that rating value. Okay, continuing with the R&R adjustments, and this is also a bogey only adjustment. It just has a table attached to it, so I wanted to provide it its own slide and its own page. It's certainly a very common adjustment on tee shots for those bogey players from those championship tee sets. You know, this adjustment can also occur on second or subsequent shots for that bogey player, you know, not just limited to the tee shot exclusively. You know, when we take a look at this, you know, bogey carry adjustment, when we look at this, we don't necessarily need to look at the carry safe distance as if the player remains in the rough. They're still able to play their next shot out of the rough toward the green or their next landing zone. We just need to get the exact distance in. And we'll have an example on this a little later on. But I want to mention that, you know, obviously when you're measuring a longer tee set for either men or women, you know, sometimes you have different tee pads as you progress forward beyond the hole. We're still going to take into account whatever that distance is from that tee set to the break point where the fairway and the rough meet, you know, to see if they deserve an adjustment here based on the carry. And you can see here, we're not going to worry about, you know, them jumping from tee pad to tee pad area. That's not likely the player is going to lay up to each tee pad. We're going to take that full amount there. So as you can see on the left side there, the top of the table, we talk about men, and at the bottom, women in yellow, and their rough lengths based on cool and warm season. Warm season, as I mentioned, are in the braces. And just based on the overall, you know, carry where the rough meets the fairway, you know, you can see the different areas. If you have 2 to 3 inch cool season grass or 2 to 2.5 inch cool season grass, and, you know, greater than 160 yards, more than 160 yards for men and more than 120 yards for women, you're going to give that a +1 adjustment to apply to that final rating value. So wanted to mention that as well. Certainly, what I failed to mention on the earlier slide, but certainly can mention, you can see the asterisk there on the C, and there's several adjustments within R&R. There's several adjustments that are shot-specific adjustments, the L, the I, the M, etc. within R&R, shot-specific adjustments are cumulative. So you can have mounds, for example, in the fairway landing zone. You can have mounds at the green, and that would be 2 points worth of point value. So just wanted to make sure I clarified that with the group there. There we go. Okay, I was in a little trouble advancing there. So wanted to go over a couple of examples here. We'll go over for both players there. We've got a 2-shot hole, par 4 hole for all players. I'm giving you the green target value for this hole is a 3 for scratch and a 4 for bogey. Our rough height in this example is 1 1/4 inch warm season grass. In this example, there's mounds in the scratch landing zone, but not in bogey. And at the green, there's a rise and drop of 6 feet for a significant portion of the green. All right, so we've got the table there on the lower right side. There, you can take a look to see what grass type we're going to look. We have warm season grass, so we're going to use the values that are in the braces. Excuse me. And then as we move along, we can see that the mounds in the scratch landing zone are not in the bogey. And then the rise and drop of 6 feet or more, significant portion of the green. So we've got our Form 1 sort of snippet, if you will, our rating form there. So for the scratch golfer, you see that I put 2 M's there. And the reason why I put that there is, mounds are in the scratch landing zone, and we've got a rise and drop of 6 feet or more for a significant portion of the green. So that deserves 2 mounds adjustments because the scratch player, for lack of better words, has to negotiate those mounds, in the rough as well in their landing zone as well as at the green. But for bogey, we only have the single M because they don't have the same landing zone mounds to negotiate. They only have the issue at the green. So with that being said, we're going to take a look at our 1 1/4 inch grass for warm season, which is, we'll talk about column 2, for lack of better words, the 1 to 2 inch warm season for men and 1 to 1 1/2 inch for women, right? So we get our baseline value for a scratch player with a 3. And we get that 3, right? That's our table value right there. But now we have mounds in both the scratch landing zone and that rise and drop to deal with. So we've got the 2 M's to deal with. So that final table, that final value we're going to put for scratch on the left side is going to be a 5. And for some reason, there we go, it finally advanced, is 5. And then you already got a sneak peek there of the bogey value there is 6. So how do we get that? If we look at the 1 1/4 inch grass with a bogey value of 4, we can take a look at that on the right hand side. Come left, we see that our value there is a 5 for both, men and women for the bogey value. We're going to add a point for that mound at the green with that rise and drop issue that we talked about. And then that's where that value goes from 5 to 6. And that's where that value comes from, 5 to 6. Hey, Scott, having a little trouble advancing. Maybe it might be better for you to sort of take over there on clicking through the slides from here on out. There we go. Okay. R&R, another R&R example. Thanks, Scott. We've got a 2-shot hole for all players, and this is where I was talking about here for some rough issues, right? We've got a rough height of 3 1/4 inch cool season. Tee shot has 150 yards of rough to carry to get to the start of the fairway, and the rough closely bordering the green is much less severe than the average, right? So if we can advance here, to take a look at this example, we know that our green target values of scratch and bogey are 4 and 5. There we go. We've got our table there. Right, we've got a table there, so we've got scratch coming in the left side for a 4. If we go over to 3 1/4 inch cool season grass, right, we're going to use the ones outside the braces. You can see that baseline is going to be a 5 for scratch. We do the same thing for bogey. Starting off on the right side there, the bogey green target value is a 5. Going over to where 3 1/4 inch grass would fit in for cool season, we see that that's a 6. So as we advance here to bring up the Form 1 table, right, you can see that only bogey, only the scratch doesn't take care of that carry that we talk about there for that second selection there, our second point there. That tee shot is a 115-yard carry. That's a bogey only adjustment. So they'll subtract 1 actually based on that R&R table value. Now the bogey will actually get that same minus I for that rough closely bordering the green, which is much less severe than the average. They also get that carry. Why? Because they've got 3 1/4 inch cool season grass and 115 yards to negotiate before the fairway breaks to where the rough breaks the fairway, excuse me. So based on that, we've got a minus adjustment and a +1 adjustment. So really what we're going to do, the net difference there is just that we're going to take the table value. So the final values for our R&R based on that table value of a 5 that we got, we're going to subtract 1 because of that I adjustment with that rough closely bordering the green is much less severe, is a 4. And then for the bogey player, we're going to subtract 1 off of that value that we got because of the I, so that 6 becomes a 5. But then we bump it back up to a 6 because of that C. So that we basically net out to a 6 there. John, are there any questions that came out of that? I know there's a lot to go over in R&R, and certainly there's a lot of points to hit.
Just a couple of questions, Matt. First, would mounding and carries be cumulative on par 4s and par 5s?
So with moundings, yes. Your R&R cumulative adjustments shot-specific adjustments are cumulative. So you have a carry and you have mounding issues, for that bogey player, I'll use in that example. Certainly that would, cumulative total to your final value.
Great. What adjustments would you recommend at the green when the rough is cut close to the green height?
Well, certainly that we talk about that inconsistent adjustments where it's a little less severe. Sometimes it's like shaved off areas, just so that, players have easier pitches or maybe can putt from there. Certainly that's where that eye adjustment you take a look at. And I failed to mention this earlier. What's nice about the R&R that you can't necessarily do with green target or fairway, for example, is, R&R, the rough height is, on average in general, is consistently cut from, sort of start to finish through the green, especially in the landing zones in the fairway, or just outside the fairway. So, you're really typically working in just one column on a hole for every hole, whereas in green target, so if you notice the grass is cut to 2 1/4 inches, hole 1, usually that's a good indication that, from holes 2, 3, 18, you're probably working in the same column, throughout the afternoon or morning that you're rating. So.
Great. And one more question. This actually kind of goes back to our previous section on green target and green measurement. So with green measurement, can you come in from the fairway to get the depth of the green and then take half of that measurement to get the width?
I'm sorry, say that again. Repeat that.
Sure. So for green measurement, can you come in from the fairway to get the depth of the green and then take half of that measurement to get the width?
Half of that measurement. Maybe I'm not, typically when we're
I'm not, I saw it in the queue and I didn't understand exactly what the question was either, but the width of the green has nothing to do with the depth. It's independent. So you can get the depth of the green based on coming in from the fairway on that line of play, but it's not always the line of play that you use to determine the green dimensions, which it's just the two measurements that best represent the size of the green to width and depth, average it out to one number. So but whoever asked that question, I might have to reach out to see if I can get more information.
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't sure if that was relative to the R&R value. So, okay, thanks. And I'll certainly, I know we're short on time and bunkers is certainly a topic I want to get into. So I'll certainly jump into that now, John, and then we'll wrap up questions there after that.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt.
All righty. So as I mentioned before, Scott, please feel free if you can to advance. Okay, bunkers, and you can certainly advance again to the next slide when we talk about bunkers and get into sort of the general slide here. Bunkers is an evaluation of how they come into play and how difficult they are to recover from. Pretty self-explanatory definition there, if you will, for bunkers. Our bunker ratings are based on green target values that set the baseline for bunkers, just like R&R. So green target values set that same baseline for bunkers, just like R&R. The fraction of the green that's also closely bordered by bunkers, and the difficulty of recovery from those bunkers. The bunker size and depth, the bunker lift, the sand condition, etc. Grass hollows, even if they were at one-time bunkers, are rated under R&R. Prepared waste areas are rated as bunkers, as well as R&R. We assume that fairway bunkers exist near a fairway landing zone, and there's that word near again, which means within 20 yards for a scratch player, and anywhere along the line of play for bogey. On a reachable par 3, reduce the table value by 1 using the N adjustment, which we'll talk about here shortly, as there is no assumed fairway bunkers. If the bogey player cannot reach the center of the green in one shot, greenside bunkers may qualify as fairway bunkers, even though there is no quote-unquote fairway in that par 3. And we'll certainly discuss that. Not always necessarily par 3s. It could be par 4 holes that Scott talked about that are just outside of transition for the bogey players, for example. Some adjustments that you'll see have that same asterisk in bunkers next to their letter indicator. Those are shot specific and may be applied in both the landing zones and at the green. Under bunkers, adjustments marked with that asterisk are cumulative and are added to the final rating table value. So fairway bunkers. The table assumes, and which we'll take a look at here on the next slide, that there is a fairway bunker that exists near a fairway landing zone for the scratch player and anywhere along the line of play for that bogey player. Bunkers within 20 yards of the edge of the landing zone in any direction are considered near the landing zone. When we're talking about the extreme adjustment for fairway bunkers, it may be applied only for those bunkers that are near the landing zone for either the scratch or bogey player. So that's a nuance within one of the adjustments language that we talk about. So certainly anywhere along the line of play is not necessarily a greenside bunker, but it needs to certainly be within 10 yards of the front of the green. Greenside bunkers can also be fairway bunkers. I know that's a sort of a unique concept, and we'll have an example in a few slides here about how we look at that. We see a lot of these greenside bunkers or fairway bunkers for a lot of times bogey players that are just out of transition for a normal par 4 hole, we'll call it, and therefore they only have like a pitch shot into the center of the green for either men or women, just a short pitch shot where a greenside bunker can actually act as a fairway bunker also in that instance. How do we measure green side bunkers, we're going to step off the areas where the bunkers are closely bordering the green, within 10 yards of the edge, right? We're going to take the total length of those red areas that you see in the picture to your right and divide that by the green circumference. If we don't fully pace them, this can be calculated using pi, which we all remember from maybe algebra or geometry class, and then multiplied by the effective diameter of the green. So in the example there on the right-hand side of your screen, the left bunker, green side bunker, there's 12 paces of coverage there from, we'll say, top to bottom. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see there's 9 paces of coverage from top to bottom. The total pacing of that green is 75 paces. So 12 plus 9 gives you that 21. 21 divided by 75 gives you 0.28. And so when we get to that green side bunker table, we're going to use the greater than 1/4 to 1/2 column, and you'll see that here momentarily. So here's a clip from the bunker green side bunker rating table straight out of the guide. So if you don't have it in front of you, this is exactly what it looks like, right? This picture explains how to determine the green side bunker percentage. The rater should determine, like I said, using that total circumference, right? Note again that we're using the green target values are the baseline for both the scratch player, which is on the left-hand side, and the bogey player, which is on the right-hand side. So this is one of those tables where, regardless if you're men or women, we're using the singular table. It just depends on if you're a scratch or a bogey player. Just like we did on the previous slide, we walked it off, and that green was a greater than 1/4 to 1/2. So the first column there that you see, the fraction of the green closely bordered by bunkers, you see the 0 to 1/4. Then the next column is greater than 1/4 to 1/2, and then on and on. So it would fall in that sort of that second column there, in that 0.28 that we saw, and that with 28% of that green is surrounded by bunkers. You also see in the parentheses there, it assumes that there are bunkers near a fairway landing zone. So you can see that that we're assuming that there is a fairway landing zone there. All right, a whole lot of adjustments here, not quite as many as R&R, but certainly there are several, and you can see the gentleman there on the right certainly probably wishes he didn't hit the ball into that green side bunker, right? So there are several common adjustments here. The carry adjustment, which talks about significant bunkers to reach a fairway landing zone, or that protects a significant portion of the green. Certainly I'm not going to read through all of them. We would be here all day, but I just want to make a point that on that carry into a green side bunker that covers a significant portion of the green, the scratch player needs to have a 5 or greater green target value in order for that carry adjustment to apply. For the bogey player, there's no minimum green target value, right? Another common adjustment is the depth adjustment, right? Based on the depth in feet for bunker of that bunker, we're going to take a look at adding additional points. Certainly a 3-foot bunker, a 4-foot bunker is different than a 7-foot deep bunker. So one will apply multiple points there and give the proper values and the proper points to those players based on the depth of that bunker. We want to make sure that we get that taken care of for both players. And then the other ones that I'll talk about is an N adjustment that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. This just means that we're going to reduce the table value by 1 if there's one shot hole, what we traditionally call par 3 holes, where there are no fairway bunkers, or reduce the table value if there's no fairway bunkers near a landing zone for a scratch player or anywhere along the line of hole. And it also talks about that greenside bunkers do not count as fairway bunkers unless the landing zone just short of the green and the greenside bunkers are near that landing zone. And then we also have the 2 adjustments, which it's funny that we have a 2 adjustment that's worth 1 point, but that is how we list it there. If there are fairway bunkers near 2 or more landing zones on a 3 or more shot hole, we're going to give that player an additional point, because we talk about in that table, we assume that there is a fairway bunker, but multiple bunkers that the player has to negotiate. We want to also provide more points to that player. All right, we've got a couple of examples, and I know we're running short on time here, so I'll move through them a little quickly so we can get some questions as well. So you've got the information there on the left-hand side of your of the screen there. Should look like a very familiar hole there. We've got a 130-yard shot for men and 105 for women on a par 3 hole. The green target values for scratch and bogey are 4 and 5 respectively. All players must carry a bunker that protects a significant portion of the green, and the greenside bunkers pacing are 36 coverage out of total of 64, and our average bunker depth is 4 feet. So what are our values? So do we have a fairway bunker on this hole? No, we don't, because both players, scratch or bogey, regardless of men or women, can reach the center of the green in one shot. You know, based on dividing 36 into 64, you know, we get a little over 56% coverage surrounding the green bunkers. So that's going to fall in that column of greater than a half to 3/4 surrounding this green. And our bunker depth is 4 feet. So jumping into the greenside bunker table, right, we're going to take a look at our baseline, which is our green target value for both scratch and bogey. First, we'll do scratch. Scratch, we've got a baseline of 4 for that green target value. We know that we have a bunker fraction of greater than 1/4 to 3/4. So if we find the number 4 on the left side there for green target value and go, you know, 3 columns, we get a baseline of 4, right? And we're going to also do the same for the bogey player, and we also do that for the and so, you know, on the right hand side we got the 4 or 5 row. We're going to go to the left there, 2 columns, and that baseline is a 5. Then we see all the adjustments there on the right hand side of the example. The bogey player has that carry adjustment exclusively, like I mentioned earlier. That's a bogey adjustment in this example only. Why is that? The scratch player doesn't have that minimum 5 green target value, so we're not going to apply it to that player. We do have a +1 depth adjustment because 4 feet is greater than 3, but not quite to the next category for the players. So we're not going to jump up to a +2. It's going to remain a +1. And then we also have an N adjustment. You know, there's no fairway bunkers. As the table says, we assume that there's a fairway bunker near a landing zone, but we don't have that here. Both players are hitting one shot to get to the center of the green. So the net values come out 0 for scratch and +1 for bogey. So after we take the baseline of what we had for scratch and bogey, we get 4, 6. And how do we get that 4 and 6? Well, once again, the scratch value baseline for the green target values of 4. The greater than a half to 3/4 is also a 4. We're going to add 1 for the depth, but we're going to subtract 1 for the no, meaning no fairway bunker. So it basically ends up being just the table value of 4. And then for the bogey player, based on a green target value of a 5, and then going to that same column, we also get a 5, right? The net value is a +1 after the carry, the depth, and the N -1 adjustment. So that 5 becomes a 6. All right, one more example here. I'll go through it relatively quickly. I know we're probably a little over time here, but want to certainly give its proper weighting here. So on a par 4 hole, we've got a hole that's 405 yards for men, 305 for women. Green target values you see there are 4 and 3 respectively. The greenside bunkers cover 11 paces out of a total of 79, and that bunker depth is 7 feet. Now you notice those 2 arrows there for that bogey player has multiple landing zones. They're just out of transition, which Scott mentioned. So those bunkers that you see there are both considered fairway bunkers. Even that bogey landing zone number 2, that's considered a fairway bunker because the shot from landing zone 1 to 2, that's the full capacity that that player's hitting, and they can't reach the center of the green. So that landing zone there, that's actually considered a fairway bunker. And then once they're on the green, it also then becomes a greenside bunker. For scratch, you can see in their landing zone, they have no fairway bunker, right? They, that's outside the 20 yards that we talk about, and then their shot into the center of the green, that bunker there at the green is just a normal greenside bunker. So if we take a look at the end result adjustments there, at the end you'll see that because of the 7-foot depth of that bunker, we have a +2. The end, because there's no fairway bunker for the scratch player, we get a net result of +1 for that player, for that scratch player. The bogey player, right? We get that same depth because that bunker is still 7 feet for that bogey player, so that's still a +2. And then for the 2 adjustment that we talked about, that last adjustment, that one is a +1. So their net adjustments, if you will, become +3. So when we take a look at the table plus the adjustments, we've got a no fairway and a yes fairway for scratch and bogey respectively. Our bunker fraction based on 11 paces divided into 79, right? That is basically 13 or just under 14%. So that's where we get the greater than 0 to 1/4. So as our baseline for scratch, we have a 4. Right, so we go to the left side there, a 4 into the 0 to 1/4 is a 2. We're going to add 1 point for scratch, so that 2 will become a 3. And then for the bogey player, we're going to still do the same thing. We're going to see that the bogey's green target value is a 3. We're going to go all the way to the 0 to 1/4, and that's where the 2 is. And that's where the 2 is. We're going to add 3 points to it from the +2 on the depth adjustment and the 1 on the 2 adjustment, so that 2 becomes a 3. That 2 + 3 = 5. So our final values for these bunkers are 3 and 5. I know I sped through that a little quickly because I was certainly wanted to appreciate everyone's time. So that's my last slide on bunkers. So any questions on that topic, John?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. We did have a lot of great questions come in on during that bunkers section. So just as a reminder, we will be sending out a Q&A document in the coming days to all attendees, kind of with answers to all the questions we were unable to get to today, knowing that we're over time now. If we could just take 2 quickly, Matt. The book mentions that bunkers 20 yards in any direction are factored in. Does this also include the bunkers 20 yards ahead of the landing zone? In theory, wouldn't the shot never get there?
Thanks. No, that's a great question, and certainly, yeah, you certainly leaning on your rating team and looking at it in any direction, you would assume that, but certainly if you have roll factors that may play a part in that landing zone, that's where we're looking at, where that bunker may come into play as well, that we talked about earlier as well. So certainly we're going to look at it in any direction, front, back, sides. That's why we take a look at it from all directions. And Scott, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, it's exactly right. There's no guarantee the ball doesn't go an extra, 10 or 15 yards. If, it gets a downslope or has a little extra carry or something like that because of a elevation change. So it's just easier to use 20 yards in any direction to try to change it based on each situation of each hole. That would be a little bit more complex.
Yeah.
Okay, just one more quickly. Do you have any tips for measuring the depth of bunkers?
No, that's a great question, and I know I breezed through that, but certainly, looking at a bunker and finding the most extreme depth where balls may not always land. Certainly there's multiple bunkers, maybe on one side or another, but certainly, looking at where most shots will end up if they end up in those bunkers. Certainly taking a look at that and using that average depth will help. Getting those green side bunker depths. like I said, certainly sometimes we use clean examples where there's one bunker on one side or the other. So obviously you take a look at that bunker, but if there's multiple bunkers, you don't want to go to the most extreme example or most extreme depth, but you also don't want to go to the shallowest point, if you will. You want to find that spot where you believe with your rating team where most balls that end up in bunkers will end up, and take that value where shots can end up than most parts of the green.
Yeah, and if the question is more about how to measure the bunker depth, a stem meter is a great tool. It's 3 feet long, so that'll get you a 3-foot bunker depth gauge. Although for women, 2 feet is not very high. It's like mid-thigh for a lot of people. 6 feet tends to be pretty much an average male height. 5 feet tends to be maybe a little bit shorter than the average woman's height, but there's still good guidelines for determining whether a bunker is 5 feet or 6 feet. So those are pretty common ways we see people measuring bunkers.
Thanks, John. Like I said, we appreciate, and we know we're over time today. So, and John mentioned, and he's done a great job moderating this session. We will have a Q&A document that we will send out probably by mid next week. Just want to make sure we send that out to all the attendees so that they can get the appropriate documentation from the Q&A, as well as a recording will be available. Just reach out to your Allied Golf Association that you represent, that you help rate with, and they can certainly help you out with this recording as well. It will be posted and they'll have access to it. They can use their discretion as to who sees the recordings and who doesn't. We leave that up to them. The next upcoming webinars, you see Thursday, June 3rd. It's our last installment for the last 5 topics, which are crossing obstacles, lateral obstacles, trees, green surface, and psych. The last 5 obstacles, and it's the same time that we started today, which is 2 o'clock Eastern time for 90 minutes. Scott, any closing remarks before we let everybody go?
No, I'll just thank everybody for attending again. And I know we had a lot of people on the webinar, so we had a lot of questions as well. So we'll definitely get those the Q&A out to everybody because we just couldn't answer all of them here in the session. So.
All right, with that, we'd like to thank you, everyone, for your time, and certainly look forward to the next session here, which is 2 weeks from today. So have a good rest of your afternoon and take care.